If you're a Niners fan, you've probably seen the headlines by now. Christian McCaffrey is missing practice. Nick Bosa is missing practice. And almost immediately, the internet starts doing what the internet does best, turning a routine situation into a full-blown contract emergency. But here's the thing, missing practice doesn't automatically mean a player is holding in. And in the cases of Christian McCaffrey and Nick Bosa, there's a much more logical explanation for why the 49ers are being cautious. The biggest mistake right now is looking at these situations separately instead of looking at the entire 49ers plan. San Francisco isn't just trying to get McCaffrey and Bosa ready for week 1. They're trying to have them ready when the games matter most. September matters, October matters, November matters, December matters, January matters, and if everything goes according to plan, February matters a whole lot more than any August practice ever will. That's why the idea that McCaffrey is secretly staging some kind of hold-in deserves a little skepticism. The discussion picked up after Chris Sims suggested that McCaffrey could potentially be holding in, but the available information from the source points in a different direction. There were brief contract discussions earlier in the offseason, according to Ian Rappaport, but there's nothing here suggesting that McCaffrey is refusing to practice because he wants a new deal. And honestly, when you look at the structure of his contract, the timing doesn't make much sense for a major renegotiation right now. McCaffrey has 2 years remaining on his current deal, covering the 2026 and 2027 seasons. The 49ers have already paid the roughly $11 million option bonus that was due in March. So this isn't a player sitting there with no money coming his way and trying to force the team's hand. There's a much bigger question sitting underneath all of this. What happens after the 2026 season? That's where this gets interesting. McCaffrey is now 30 years old, and he's coming off a season in which he handled 413 touches. That's a massive workload for any running back, and especially important when you're talking about one of the most valuable offensive players on the entire roster. And yet, despite that workload, McCaffrey still showed why the 49ers have been willing to build so much of their offense around him. That's the contradiction San Francisco eventually has to solve. On one side, you've got a superstar who can completely change the identity of an offense when he's healthy. On the other, you've got the reality that running backs don't exactly become less valuable to their teams as they get older, while magically becoming less expensive at the same time. That's where contract timing becomes critical. If McCaffrey has another huge season in 2026, the 49ers could enter the 2027 offseason with a very different conversation on their hands. At that point, he'd be heading into what is effectively the final year of his current contract, and that's when the leverage could shift. Imagine McCaffrey stays healthy, produces at a high level, and shows that last season wasn't some one-year resurgence. Suddenly, San Francisco has to ask itself whether it wants to extend the relationship and put more guaranteed money on the table. That's a much more logical moment for a significant extension discussion than right now. Could something happen this offseason? Sure. But based on the situation described in the source, if the 49ers were to make any adjustment, it would more likely be some kind of incentive sweetener rather than a massive reconstruction of the entire contract. And that distinction matters, because there's a tendency in NFL coverage to treat every contract conversation like somebody is either getting paid $100 million tomorrow or walking out the door. Real roster management isn't that simple. Sometimes it's about waiting. Sometimes it's about seeing how a player performs. Sometimes it's about protecting an investment you've already made. And with McCaffrey, there's another factor that can't be ignored. Those 413 touches. If you're the 49ers, why would you want your 30-year-old superstar running back taking unnecessary reps in August when you've already got a pretty good idea of what he can do? You wouldn't. You'd want him healthy, you'd want him fresh, and most importantly, you'd want him available when the season starts getting ugly and every possession starts feeling like it has a mortgage attached to it. So here's the question for you, Niners fan. If McCaffrey has another monster season in 2026, should the 49ers extend him before he reaches the final year of his contract? Yes or no? And don't just give me a yes or no. Tell me why. Because that answer says a lot about how you view the risk of paying a running back versus the value of keeping one of the most dynamic players in Kyle Shanahan's offense. And that's only half of this contract story. Because while McCaffrey's situation is mostly about patience and timing, Nick Bosa's situation could become a much bigger financial conversation much sooner than some fans realize. Now let's get to Nick Bosa, because this is where the contract conversation starts getting a little more serious. Bosa's situation is different from Christian McCaffrey's, and that's important. McCaffrey still has 2 seasons remaining on his current deal. Bosa has 3, with his contract currently running through 2028. On paper, that sounds like there shouldn't be any urgency whatsoever. But the NFL doesn't really work on the basis of how many years are printed on a contract. It works on leverage, guarantees, performance, and what the market is about to demand. And that's exactly why next offseason could become very interesting for Bosa. Right now, Bosa is 28 years old. That's still a premium age for an elite pass rusher, especially one who has already established himself as one of the best defensive players in football. The 49ers didn't give him that massive contract because they were hoping he'd become a star. They gave it to him because he already was one. But here's the catch. According to the information in the source, the meaningful guarantees in Bosa's contract essentially run out after this season, with only relatively minor guaranteed money remaining beyond that point. There are also bonuses scheduled for 2027, including roughly $769,000, but those numbers don't change the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that Bosa could have serious leverage after the 2026 season. Think about what happens if he puts together the kind of season everyone knows he's capable of having. He stays healthy, he racks up pressures, he gets back to being a nightmare for opposing offensive tackles, and most importantly, he brings the sack production that San Francisco desperately needed last season. That last part matters more than people realize. The 49ers finished last in the NFL in sacks in the previous season without Bosa leading the charge. That's not just a small statistical footnote, that's a giant flashing sign on the defensive whiteboard. When you remove a player like Bosa from the equation, the entire pass rush has to compensate. Quarterbacks get more time, coverage has to hold longer, defensive backs are asked to survive more snaps, and suddenly a defense that looks talented on paper can spend entire afternoons chasing quarterbacks instead of attacking them. That's why Bosa's value isn't captured by his sack total alone. He's the guy offenses have to account for before the ball is even snapped. If you're an offensive coordinator preparing for San Francisco, you don't casually walk into a game and say, "We'll deal with Nick Bosa when we get there." You build protections around him, you move the quarterback, you chip him with tight ends and running backs, you change the launch point, you identify where he is on practically every important passing down. That's what elite pass rushers do. And that's exactly why the 49ers could face a fascinating financial decision next offseason. Suppose Bosa has a massive 2026 campaign. Not just a good season. A season where he looks like the dominant version of himself again and reminds everybody why San Francisco invested so heavily in him in the first place. At that point, the question may not be whether Bosa deserves another adjustment. It may be how aggressive the 49ers need to be to keep him happy and keep him in Santa Clara long term. And this is where things can get expensive very quickly. The pass rusher market doesn't wait around for teams to feel comfortable. Every time another elite edge player signs a massive contract, that player's deal becomes a data point for the next negotiation. If Bosa dominates in 2026, his representatives will have a very strong argument that his current compensation should be evaluated against whatever the top of the market looks like at that time. That's where the calendar becomes San Francisco's enemy. The 49ers don't necessarily need to do anything today. In fact, there may be a very good reason not to. Why negotiate before you have to? Let the season play out. See what Bosa looks like physically. See how productive he is. See how the defense performs with him. Then make the decision with more information. But here's the problem: if you're the 49ers, you might also be bidding against yourself by waiting too long. If Bosa explodes in 2026, the price isn't going to get cheaper because San Francisco waited patiently. It's probably going the other direction. And that's the balancing act that makes NFL roster construction so fascinating. You don't want to hand out massive guarantees simply because you're afraid of losing someone. But you also don't want to wait until the player has every ounce of leverage imaginable and then realize you're negotiating from the basement while the market is sitting on the roof. For the 49ers, this is especially important because Bosa isn't some replaceable rotational pass rusher. There are players you can lose and survive. There are players you can replace with a committee. And then there are players who change what the opposing offense is allowed to do. Bosa is in that third category. That's why any conversation about his contract has to be tied to his on-field impact rather than simply the number of years remaining on his deal. And there's another piece to this that I think gets lost when people start panicking over practice absences. If Bosa is being ramped up carefully, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything negative about his contract. In fact, you could argue that the opposite is true. The 49ers have every financial reason to protect their investment. They have every competitive reason to protect their best pass rusher. And they have every practical reason to make sure that Bosa isn't trying to prove something in August and paying for it in November. Nobody remembers who won the August practice. Attendance championship. The team that gets healthier in December gets remembered. That's the point San Francisco has to keep front and center. So when you see Bosa missing a practice, don't immediately jump to the conclusion that we're watching contract drama season 47. Look at the bigger picture. He's under contract. He's not entering the exact same situation as McCaffrey. And the real contractual pressure point appears much more likely to emerge after the 2026 season, particularly if he puts together the kind of dominant performance his talent suggests is possible. And here's where I want your opinion, Niners fan. Yes or no, should Nick Bosa be the 49ers' next major contract priority after the 2026 season? Because there are two very different schools of thought here. One says you pay elite pass rushers whatever it takes because they are almost impossible to replace. The other says the 49ers have to protect the salary cap and avoid stacking enormous contracts at every premium position. I'm curious which side you're on because there really isn't a painless answer. And that's what makes this entire situation so much more interesting than the headlines suggest. McCaffrey's situation is mostly about patience. Bosa's is about building leverage. And both situations point toward the same thing. The 49ers aren't dealing with a roster that's falling apart. They're dealing with the reality that keeping elite players together takes timing, discipline, and some pretty serious financial chess. And the next move could end up being very important. When you step back and look at both Christian McCaffrey and Nick Bosa, the bigger story becomes pretty clear. This isn't really a story about two stars refusing to practice. It's a story about the 49ers managing two of the most valuable players on their roster while trying to protect the bigger objective. And that objective is obvious. San Francisco isn't trying to win the preseason. They're trying to build a team that's still dangerous when January arrives. That's why the reaction to these practice absences has gotten a little too dramatic. Every time a star player misses a practice, somebody wants to connect the dots to a contract dispute. Then, a rumor gets repeated, another headline appears, and suddenly fans are debating whether a player is unhappy, holding in, or preparing to demand a new deal. But sometimes a missed practice is just a missed practice. In the case of McCaffrey and Bosa, the more reasonable explanation is that the 49ers are being careful with two players they absolutely cannot afford to lose for an extended period. Think about McCaffrey. He's coming off a season with 413 touches, and he's now 30 years old. His value to the offense is enormous, but that also means the 49ers have to manage how they use him. There's no prize for having your starting running back lead the team in August touches. The prize is having him healthy when you're facing a division rival in December with playoff positioning on the line. That's the difference between short-term thinking and championship thinking. The same logic applies to Bosa. San Francisco's defense looked completely different without him. The pass rush suffered, and the team finished last in the NFL in sacks. That's precisely why getting Bosa right isn't just about protecting one player. It's about protecting the structure of the entire defense. When Bosa is healthy and attacking off the edge, everything behind him becomes easier. The defensive backs don't have to cover forever. The quarterback doesn't get unlimited time to find a receiver. The rest of the defensive front gets better opportunities because the offense can't simply dedicate every resource to stopping everyone else. That's why Bosa's health has consequences that stretch far beyond his own stat line. And that's also why the 49ers don't need to panic about the contract situation right now. McCaffrey has 2 years left. Bosa has 3. There are future decision points coming, but neither player is currently in a situation where San Francisco has to tear apart its financial structure tomorrow morning. That's actually a pretty good position to be in. The 49ers can watch, they can evaluate, they can see how both players perform, and then they can make decisions based on reality rather than speculation. That's important because contract negotiations in the NFL are rarely just about whether a player is good. They're about age, they're about injury, history, they're about workload, they're about guarantees, they're about the market, they're about what the salary cap looks like, and they're about what the rest of the roster needs. That's why saying, just extend him now, sounds easy until you actually have to build the roster around the contract. If San Francisco gives McCaffrey more guaranteed money, that decision affects future flexibility. If the 49ers eventually give Bosa another massive adjustment, that affects future flexibility too. And the front office has to balance those decisions against every other player it wants to keep. That's the part fans don't always see. The salary cap doesn't care how much you love a player. It doesn't care how many jerseys he's sold. It doesn't care how badly you want to keep the core together. The math eventually shows up at the door. That's why timing matters so much. With McCaffrey, the 49ers can afford to wait and see what 2026 looks like. If he has another elite season, then the conversation becomes much more serious heading into 2027. With Bosa, the situation could become even more urgent after this season because of where the guarantees and contract structure sit. If he dominates in 2026, his leverage could increase dramatically, and that creates an interesting offseason ahead. But there's one thing that should matter more than all of the contract speculation: availability. Because the most expensive contract in football is useless on Sunday if the player isn't healthy enough to play. That's why the 49ers have to be thinking beyond week 1. They need McCaffrey in October. They need Bosa in November. They need both of them in December. And if San Francisco gets where it believes it can go, it needs both players operating at full strength in January. That's the real reason these situations deserve context. You don't protect an elite player because you don't believe in him. You protect him because you know exactly how important he is. And that's why I wouldn't look at these practice absences and immediately see red flags. I'd look at them and ask a much more useful question: what is the 49ers' best chance of having McCaffrey and Bosa at their absolute best when the season is on the line? If the answer involves limiting some August practice reps, that's a trade the organization should make every single time. Now, eventually, the contract conversations are going to become real. McCaffrey will eventually reach that point where another extension becomes a legitimate discussion. Bosa could potentially enter an even more complicated negotiation if he has a monster season. Those conversations are coming, but they're not necessarily happening today. And that distinction is what got lost in all the noise. So if you're following San Francisco 49ers news, don't just watch the headlines. Watch the timing, watch the contract guarantees, watch the workload, watch the production, and most importantly, watch what happens when these players actually get onto the field, because that's where the real answers are going to come from. And now I want to hear from you, Niners fan. If you could lock up only one of these two players with another major contract right now, who are you choosing? Christian McCaffrey or Nick Bosa? And there's no easy answer. McCaffrey can completely transform the offense when he's healthy. Bosa can completely transform the defense when he's healthy. One gives Kyle Shanahan a chess piece that defenses have to account for on every snap. The other forces opposing quarterbacks to speed up their entire game plan. So tell me which player you'd prioritize and why. And if you enjoyed this Niners News Today breakdown, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, share this video with another Niners fan, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update. We're pushing toward 2,000 subscribers, and every subscription helps the channel keep growing. The biggest lesson here is pretty simple. Don't let every practice absence turn into a contract apocalypse. McCaffrey and Bosa are both in stable contractual situations right now. Their future negotiations will depend on performance, health, timing, and leverage. The smart move for the 49ers is to protect their stars today while keeping their options open for tomorrow. Because in the NFL, the goal isn't to win the headline in August. The goal is to still be standing when the games get cold, the margin gets thin, and one great player can be the difference between going home and playing for a championship. That's where McCaffrey and Bosa matter most. And that's where this contract story gets really interesting.